Hello, and welcome to English Listening Stories for Beginners. Today's story is called Scary Night Alone. It's a simple and exciting story to help you learn English naturally. In this story, you will listen to clear, slow English, so you can improve your vocabulary, listening skills, and understanding. Are you ready? Let's begin the story, Scary Night Alone. Using simple vocabulary is one of the most effective ways to help English learners, especially beginners, feel more confident and stay engaged. When learners hear words they already know or can easily guess from the context, they are more likely to understand the story and stay motivated to continue. That's why in our story, Scary Night Alone, we have carefully selected vocabulary that is easy to follow, even for someone at the early stages of learning English. We avoid complex expressions and idioms that can confuse beginners. Instead, we focus on everyday words and phrases that are useful in daily life. For example, rather than saying the atmosphere was ominous, we might say the night was quiet and dark. Instead of using a word like frightened, we may say she was very scared. This helps learners connect directly with the story without needing a dictionary or translation tool. They begin to understand words not just through their definitions, but by seeing them in action, used in sentences, used in emotional situations, and used in a real context that brings the language to life. Repetition also plays an important role in beginner-friendly English stories. Repeating simple words helps reinforce vocabulary. If the word dark appears many times in a story, learners become familiar with it and remember it more easily. Repetition is a natural way to strengthen understanding without feeling like studying. It mirrors how people learn their first language, by hearing the same words again and again in different situations. Another benefit of simple vocabulary is that it creates a smooth listening experience. Listeners are not constantly stopping to figure out meanings or guess what something means. This keeps the flow of the story going and allows learners to absorb the rhythm and structure of English sentences. They start to pick up not just words, but how those words work together in real communication. It's not just about learning the word door, but understanding sentences like she walked the door or the door was open. Simple vocabulary doesn't mean boring or childish stories. Even with easy words, you can tell a suspenseful, emotional, or dramatic story. In Scary Night Alone, we use simple language to build a strong atmosphere. Words like cold, dark, alone, and noise carry a lot of meaning, especially when placed in the right order. Listeners can feel the fear or suspense, not because we use big words, but because the story is told in a clear, visual way that anyone can understand. This also helps with speaking skills. After hearing simple words and phrases used correctly in a story, learners often feel more ready to try using those words themselves. They hear the sentence, she was scared, and later, when talking about their own experience, they might say, I was scared too. The language becomes personal and usable, which is a big step in gaining confidence as an English speaker. We also avoid cultural references or advanced grammar structures that could confuse beginners. For example, we don't use phrasal verbs like freaked out or creeped up unless we explain them through the story. Instead, we say she was scared or she heard a sound, which are more direct and clear. Over time, as learners grow more comfortable, we can gently introduce new words, but always in a way that supports understanding. The goal is to help beginners feel successful. When they can follow a story from beginning to end, even if it's simple, it builds their motivation. They think, I understood that. That feeling is powerful. It keeps them coming back to listen more, to learn more, and to try more. Each word they understand adds to their foundation, and soon they're able to handle longer stories, more vocabulary, and eventually natural conversation. Using simple vocabulary also helps listeners connect emotionally. When the language is easy to follow, they don't just understand the words. They feel the story. They can imagine being in the house alone at night. They can feel the fear of hearing a sound in the dark. And they can enjoy the ending without being lost. That emotional Connection helps the language stay in their memory longer. It's not just learning, it's experiencing English in a way that feels real, personal, and fun. Clear and slow narration is one of the most essential elements when creating English listening stories for beginners. When learners are just starting to understand English, fast or unclear speech can make them feel overwhelmed, frustrated, or even discouraged. That's why it's so important to speak slowly and clearly with the right pauses, pronunciation, and rhythm. This approach allows learners to catch every word, understand the meaning, and gradually become familiar with how English sounds in real conversations. When the pace is slow, they have enough time to think, process the sentence, and connect the meaning with the words they hear. Many beginners struggle with listening because native English speakers often talk quickly and link words together. Phrases like gonna go or dunno are natural in everyday conversation, but they are hard to catch for someone who's still learning. In a slow narration, we separate words clearly, pronounce them fully, and avoid running them together. For example, instead of saying, she's gonna go there, we say, she is going to go there. This makes it easier for learners to recognize each word, hear the correct grammar, and understand how the sentence is formed. Slow narration also helps learners with pronunciation. When words are spoken clearly, they hear the correct sounds and stress patterns. This is especially useful for learning the sounds that don't exist in their native language. For instance, the difference between ship and sheep might be hard to hear at first, but when spoken slowly, the sounds are easier to notice. Over time, repeated listening trains their ears and improves their ability to hear those differences, which is an important skill for speaking and understanding English naturally. Clear speech also builds listening confidence. If a story is told too fast, learners might miss a key word and lose track of the whole sentence. But when the pace is slower, even if they don't understand every word, they can still follow the general idea. This helps them stay focused and interested. It reduces the feeling of stress and helps learners enjoy the experience. The more they listen, the more they improve and they start to understand faster speech over time. Slow narration is not just a teaching technique. It's a bridge that takes them from basic understanding to fluent comprehension. Another benefit of clear and slow narration is that it allows time for mental translation. Many beginners still think in their native language. When they hear a sentence, they translate it in their mind before they understand it. This takes time. A slow pace gives them enough space to do that translation and still follow along. As they listen to more stories, they slowly begin to think in English instead of translating. But that transition takes time, and it starts with giving them enough space to think. Pacing also affects how emotions are delivered in the story. When a story is read slowly and with feeling, learners can connect not only to the words but to the emotions behind them. For example, if a narrator says she was alone, the night was quiet, then she heard a sound. With the right pause and tone, the listener feels the suspense. They are not just hearing English, they are feeling the story. This emotional connection makes the language more memorable. Learners don't just learn vocabulary, they remember the feeling that came with it, which helps them recall the words later. In addition, a slower pace allows learners to notice grammar patterns. They hear how sentences are formed. They begin to understand that she is walking, is present continuous, or that he didn't go, uses the past tense. These patterns become more familiar when they are spoken clearly and slowly, giving learners time to absorb the structure naturally. They don't need to study grammar rules. They learn by hearing real examples used in a meaningful context. Clear narration also supports different learning styles. Some learners are visual, some are auditory, and some need both. When spoken English is clear and slow, auditory learners benefit the most, but all learners are more likely to succeed. Even if someone doesn't read or write English well, they can still improve by listening. For many people, listening is the first step toward fluency, especially when they don't have access to a classroom or teacher. In storytelling, the power of clear and slow narration lies in its simplicity. It opens the door for beginners to step into the English language with confidence. It gives them the tools to listen, understand, and respond. It shows them that English doesn't have to be fast or difficult to be meaningful or exciting. Through a clear and slow voice, they find clarity, motivation, and the courage to continue learning. A real, life storytelling style is a powerful method for helping beginners learn English because it creates a connection between the language and everyday experiences. When learners hear a story that feels familiar, relatable, or emotionally engaging, they are more likely to understand the meaning of the words and remember them. Instead of just studying grammar or vocabulary in isolation, they experience English in a natural, meaningful context. This style mirrors how people naturally learn languages, through situations, emotions, and human interactions. By listening to real, life stories, learners pick up language the same way children do, through patterns, repetition, and connection. Using real life situations in storytelling gives learners useful vocabulary that they can actually use. For example, in a story like Scary Night Alone, the character might be in a house, walking through a hallway, hearing a strange sound, or turning on a light. These are everyday actions that most people understand, and they involve common words like door, window, light, quiet, noise, and scared. When these words appear in a realistic story, learners begin to associate them with specific feelings and images. They don't just learn that scared means afraid. They feel what scared means because the story creates that emotion. This method is also helpful because it keeps learners interested. Many traditional learning materials are dry or repetitive, but when the story feels real, even if it is simple, learners become curious. They want to know what happens next. They begin to care about the character, and they listen more carefully to understand the details. This attention leads to better learning. When someone is emotionally invested, their brain remembers more. That's why stories that are realistic, emotional, or suspenseful are such effective learning tools. They pull the listener in, and the language becomes part of the experience. A real, life storytelling style also helps with understanding sentence structure and tone. When learners hear sentences like, "She heard a noise outside," or "He slowly opened the door," they learn how to use verbs, prepositions, and adjectives in a natural way. These sentences are not from a textbook. They come from a believable situation. The learner hears how the language sounds when someone is describing something real. Over time, they start to speak or write in the same natural style because they've heard so many examples in context. It's like learning by example without needing to memorize rules. Another benefit of this style is that it introduces cultural elements in a subtle way. When a story reflects real, life situations, it often includes small cultural clues, such as how people react to fear, how they behave at night, what kind of homes they live in, or how they describe emotions. These small details help learners not only with language, but also with understanding how English is used in everyday life. They begin to feel more comfortable with the language and the culture it represents. Real, life stories also make it easier for learners to imagine the scene, which supports visual learning. When a narrator describes a dark room, the sound of wind, and a person walking alone, the learner can create a picture in their mind. This kind of mental imagery strengthens understanding. Even if the learner does not understand every word, the images help fill in the meaning. Over time, the repeated connection between words and images builds a stronger vocabulary and better comprehension. This storytelling style also gives space for natural repetition. In real-life stories, some words and phrases naturally appear many times. For example, the word alone might be used several times in a story about a person spending the night by themselves. This repetition does not feel forced because it fits the story. Learners hear the word in different contexts, which helps them understand it more deeply and remember it more easily. They learn how the same word can be used in different ways, and they start to feel more comfortable using it themselves. Another important feature of real life storytelling is that it includes natural emotions and reactions. Beginners often struggle to understand how emotions are expressed in English, but stories that reflect real life show them how people speak when they are scared, excited, surprised, or calm. For example, if a character says, "Who's there?" in a nervous voice, the learner understands not only the words but also the feeling. This helps them learn how to express emotions in English, which is a key part of communication. Realistic stories also build trust between the listener and the narrator. When the story feels real, the learner feels safe and connected. They are not just listening to a language lesson. They are listening to a moment in someone's life. This emotional safety helps reduce fear and anxiety, especially for beginners who may feel unsure about their skills. They start to believe that they can understand English and that learning is possible and enjoyable. Focus on listening practice is one of the most important elements in helping English learners improve their language skills, especially at the beginner level. Listening is the foundation of language learning because it comes before speaking, reading, or writing. Just like babies learn to understand before they can talk, beginner learners need to listen to a lot of English before they can use it confidently. That's why focusing on listening in every story is a key part of the learning experience. When learners hear English regularly, they begin to understand the rhythm, the sounds, and the structure of the language naturally and without pressure. Listening practice helps learners develop their ears for the language. At first, English may sound fast, unclear, or unfamiliar, but with regular exposure through stories, learners begin to hear differences between words and sounds. They start to recognize common phrases and sentence patterns. For example, they might start noticing how questions are asked, how past tense is used, or how certain expressions are repeated. This recognition is the first step toward understanding and eventually speaking the language. By hearing the same patterns again and again, the brain begins to learn them automatically. One of the key benefits of listening, focused learning, is that it improves comprehension without needing to memorize grammar rules. Grammar becomes something learners feel instead of something they study. When a character in a story says, "I was alone," or "she heard a noise," learners understand that this is past tense simply by hearing it used correctly in context. They may not know the technical terms, but they start to internalize the rules. This natural approach is less stressful and more effective, especially for people who struggle with traditional grammar lessons. Another advantage of listening practice is that it helps learners with pronunciation, even if they are not speaking yet. By hearing how words are said, learners build a mental library of sounds. They begin to know what English words should sound like. When they eventually start speaking, they already have a model in their minds. They may not be perfect at first, but their pronunciation is much closer to natural English because they've heard the correct sounds many times. This is why listening is so essential, especially before focusing heavily on speaking. Listening practice also helps learners understand the flow of conversation. In stories, especially ones told in a real-life style, learners hear how people naturally speak, how they pause, how they change tone, and how they react to different situations. These are things that are difficult to teach through books or worksheets. But in a listening story, these features are part of the experience. Learners pick them up naturally. For example, when someone in the story says, "Who's there?" with a frightened voice, the learner hears both the words and the emotion behind them. This is an important skill in real communication, understanding not just what people say, but how they feel when they say it. Stories that focus on listening are also more engaging. Many learners find it hard to concentrate on grammar exercises or vocabulary drills, but a good story keeps their attention. They want to know what happens next. This natural interest leads to more focused listening, and more focused listening leads to better learning. When learners are interested in the content, they are more likely to listen closely, more likely to repeat listening later, and more likely to remember what they hear. Listening also improves vocabulary in a meaningful way. Instead of just learning a list of words, learners hear how those words are used in real sentences. They understand the meaning from context, and they see how one word can appear in different situations. For example, the word dark might appear as a dark room, it's getting dark, or she was afraid of the dark. By hearing the same word in different forms, learners get a deeper understanding of how to use it. This is more effective than just memorizing the word with a translation. Regular listening also helps learners build confidence. At first, they may only understand a few words, but with time, they start to understand full sentences, then full stories. This sense of progress is very motivating. It shows that learning is happening even if it's slow. Every time they listen to a story and understand more than before, they feel encouraged to keep going. Listening becomes not just a practice, but a source of success and enjoyment. Focusing on listening also prepares learners for real-world communication. In everyday life, listening is one of the most common language skills. Whether someone is watching a movie, listening to instructions, or having a conversation, strong listening skills are essential. By training their ears with listening stories, learners become better prepared for these real-life situations. They are less likely to be confused or overwhelmed when they hear English in the world around them. Simple vocabulary and short sentences are essential when creating English listening stories for beginners because they make the language accessible and understandable right from the start. Many learners struggle with long or complex sentences filled with unfamiliar words. If the vocabulary is too difficult, they lose the meaning of the sentence and feel frustrated. But when we use simple, clear words and keep the sentence structure short, learners can follow the story, understand what is being said, and build their confidence step by step. The goal is not to impress with advanced language, but to communicate clearly so that learners can absorb the story, feel connected to it, and grow their skills in a way that feels achievable and enjoyable. Using simple vocabulary does not mean dumbing down the story. It means choosing words that learners are likely to know or can easily guess from context. For example, instead of saying, "She cautiously ascended the staircase," we can say, "She walked up the stairs slowly." Both sentences carry the same meaning, but the second one is easier to understand. When stories use simple words like walk, run, dark, door, sound, or light, learners can understand the message without needing a dictionary. This keeps them engaged, prevents confusion, and helps them enjoy the story while improving their language skills naturally. Short sentences are equally important because they reduce cognitive load. When a sentence is long, the learner has to hold more information in their memory before they can process its meaning. Beginners often don't have the listening fluency to do that yet. A sentence like "The girl who had been sitting quietly by the window suddenly turned her head when she heard a noise outside" may be too much at once, but breaking it into smaller parts. The girl sat by the window. She was quiet. She heard a noise. She turned her head makes it easier to follow. Each idea is presented clearly and simply, giving the learner a chance to process one thought at a time without feeling lost. When vocabulary is simple and sentences are short, the brain has more room to focus on understanding the story and learning the structure of the language. Learners start to notice how basic English sentences are formed. They hear patterns like "she is walking," "he saw something," or "it was dark." These patterns are the building blocks of the language, and hearing them repeatedly in an understandable way helps learners internalize grammar naturally. They don't need to study grammar rules directly. They hear correct usage in context and begin to use it themselves through imitation. Simple vocabulary also makes it easier to repeat key ideas. Repetition is a powerful tool in language learning, especially when it doesn't feel forced. When a word like night or alone appears multiple times in different sentences, learners start to recognize it. First they hear it, then they understand it, and eventually they can say or write it themselves. Stories that use simple words in varied ways help learners see how the same word can be used across different situations, building both vocabulary and confidence at the same time. Another benefit of simple language is that it makes the emotional tone of the story more effective. When a character says, "I was scared," the meaning is direct and powerful. Learners understand not only the word scared, but also the feeling behind it. Complex language can sometimes hide the emotion, but simplicity allows it to shine through. This emotional clarity helps learners connect with the story on a personal level, making the experience more memorable and meaningful. When language is easy to understand, learners focus less on decoding the words and more on feeling the story, which improves retention and deepens comprehension. Using short sentences also helps with pacing and rhythm in listening. Beginners benefit from a steady pace, and short sentences naturally create pauses between ideas. These pauses give the learner time to think, translate if necessary, and stay caught up with the story. If the story moves too fast or the sentences are too long, learners can miss key information and become discouraged. Short, simple sentences give them room to breathe, listen, and understand, which builds a strong foundation for more advanced learning later. Keeping vocabulary simple also encourages learners to speak. When they hear common, easy words used correctly, they are more likely to repeat them and use them in their own speaking. If all they hear are long, difficult words, they may be afraid to try. But when they hear "she is afraid" or "he opened the door," they feel that they too can say those things. Simple language lowers the barrier to speaking and builds the courage to participate in conversation. This is a key step in moving from passive listening to active language use. Repetition and clarity are two of the most important techniques for helping English beginners improve their listening and comprehension skills. When learners hear a new word or sentence structure once, they may not understand it, but if they hear it again in a slightly different way or in a new context, their brains begin to recognize and remember it. Repetition allows the mind to process, absorb, and eventually master the language. It's not about repeating the same sentence word for word, but about presenting key phrases and vocabulary naturally, multiple times throughout the story, helping learners to develop familiarity without feeling bored or overwhelmed. Clarity in speech delivery is just as important. Beginners are still learning the sounds of English, and they need to hear words pronounced clearly and at a moderate pace. If a narrator speaks too quickly or uses unclear pronunciation, learners will struggle to follow along, especially if they are unfamiliar with the rhythm and flow of the language. When a storyteller speaks slowly, with clean pronunciation and natural pauses, it gives learners the chance to identify each word, understand its meaning, and connect it to the words that come before and after. This kind of listening experience builds confidence and makes it easier to follow the story from beginning to end. Repetition in stories also supports memory. The more often a word is heard, the more likely it is to stick in the learner's mind. For example, in a story called "Scary Night Alone," the word "night" might be used in the beginning, middle, and end of the story. It may appear in different forms like dark night, quiet night, or a cold night. Each time the learner hears it, they are reminded of its meaning, and the repeated exposure helps move the word from short-term to long-term memory. Over time, this repetition creates a solid vocabulary foundation that learners can build on as they progress. Repetition also works well when introducing sentence patterns. For example, if a character repeatedly says, "I am afraid," "I am cold," or "I am alone," the learner becomes familiar with the structure "I am" plus adjective. This helps them understand how to describe feelings or states of being. Later, they might hear or try using similar sentences like "I am happy," "I am tired," or "I am ready." The repetition of structure, not just words, teaches learners how English works without needing to explain grammar rules directly. It becomes part of their natural understanding, developed through exposure and listening. Clarity helps learners separate one word from the next in normal fashion. Speech, especially in native conversation, words can blend together, making it hard for learners to recognize where one ends and the next begins. For instance, did you see it? Might sound like did ya see it to a beginner, which can be confusing. But when storytellers speak clearly, saying each word distinctly, did you see it? It gives the listener a chance to understand. This kind of listening input trains the ear to recognize words in different contexts and prepares learners for faster, more natural speech later on. The combination of repetition and clarity also reduces learner anxiety. When students can understand what they are hearing, they feel successful. That success motivates them to keep learning. If the language is too fast or too complex, they may feel lost and discouraged. But if the story repeats important parts and delivers them clearly, learners can follow along even if they don't understand every single word. They learn to rely on what they do understand, and they feel a sense of progress, even in the early stages of learning. Another benefit of repetition is that it reinforces the emotional tone of the story. If a phrase like "she was alone" is used more than once, it emphasizes the feeling of loneliness and builds a stronger connection to the character's experience. When learners hear this repeated with emotion in the narrator's voice, they not only learn the meaning of the words, but also how to express and understand feelings in English. This adds depth to their listening experience and helps them develop both language and empathy skills at the same time. Clarity also plays a big role in helping learners with listening comprehension tests or real-world listening tasks. The clearer the input, the better the learner can grasp the full message. They learn how to listen for important details, recognize keywords, and understand the overall story, even if some parts are new or unfamiliar. Clear storytelling builds their ability to follow spoken English in other formats like conversations, podcasts, or videos. When repetition and clarity are used together, they create a powerful learning environment. Repetition gives the learner the chance to hear something more than once, allowing the brain to practice and retain it. Clarity ensures that each time they hear it, they actually understand what is being said. This combination builds strong listening habits, boosts vocabulary, supports sentence formation, and prepares learners for real English use outside the classroom or listening practice environment.